Most boxers train hard, but don't actually peak the right qualities at the right time. How do you know you're developing the right qualities to peak for fight night, like speed and power, without letting other qualities like strength and endurance just wither away? Today we're breaking down how to periodize your strength and conditioning so you can peak the right qualities at the right time without losing them. Let's get into it. So before we get into the periodization model that I use, it's important that we look at traditional approaches to periodization. And so you've probably heard of models like linear, block, undulating, maybe even conjugate. Each has its pros and cons, but all have one big limitation when it comes to boxing. And let's start with the first two, which are the linear and block style periodization approaches. So these are probably the most traditional approaches, where a linear approach usually means we're starting with higher volumes and lower intensities, and as we progress, we're going to go to lower volumes and higher intensities. Whereas a block approach is quite similar, but each block actually has a distinct focus that leads into the next block. So for example, block 1 might focus on hypertrophy, then block 2 might focus on maximum strength, and then the last block you might get into some speed and power. And there's nothing really wrong with these, but there's one big issue. When you're only focusing on one quality at a time, what happens to the other qualities as you progress further on down the training cycle? So let's look at an example of an 18-week training cycle. Let's say you spend 6 weeks building some hypertrophy and endurance, 6 weeks of getting strong, and then 6 weeks of focusing on speed and power. By the time you reach that last block, those early adaptations you created for, let's say, hypertrophy and endurance are potentially gone or even fading by the time you get to that speed and power block. And obviously boxers don't need a massive amount of hypertrophy work, but I still think it plays a pretty important role in just some general prep. So we know that building muscle is obviously going to act like some armor to take shots, improves joint health, and also kind of lays the foundation for when you get into more higher intensity blocks further down the line. So I think this is where the conjugate style of periodization has come in, and it's gained a lot of popularity, especially in combat sports. And basically what the conjugate training approach does is that it trains multiple qualities at once, and it has separate days for each of these qualities. So one day might be a max effort day for strength. They have a dynamic effort day, which focuses on more speed and power. And then the last day is a repetition effort, where that comes into hypertrophy and accessory-based lifts. And in theory, it's actually a really good system. But one of the major drawbacks from the conjugate approach is that it was originally designed for powerlifters. So it was designed for powerlifters that actually have or can allow more volume to strength training. That is their sport. So they're obviously going to be spending a lot more hours in the gym compared to boxers. And most boxers just don't have the time, energy, resources, or recovery capacity to spend that much time in the gym focusing on, high volume strength training, because you have to also account for boxing technical training, any outside conditioning work you might be doing, obviously your sparring. So this is what brings us to what I believe is probably going to be the most effective and optimal approach to periodization, is the vertical integration model of periodization. So essentially what we're talking about with the vertical integration model of periodization is we're developing all physical qualities all year round, like speed, power, strength, mobility, endurance, hypertrophy if you need it, but we just shift the overall emphasis from one block to the other, depending on where we are in the training year and what you have to specifically focus on. So instead of focusing on one quality at a time, like the block periodization approach or the linear approach, we are going to be building all qualities all the time, so none falls behind. We just shift the relative volume of each depending on the phase we're in, depending if you're in or out of camp, depending on what goals, and then also what weaknesses and strengths you have. So for example, during an out of camp phase or a general prep phase, we might actually spend more time on adding a bit more muscle through some hypertrophy work, doing a bit more general strength training. But as we move closer to fight night and moving into camp, our focus is actually going to shift to more speed, power, and reactivity, but you're still going to be maintaining those other qualities just in the background. And I think this approach is going to be far more optimal and powerful for two main reasons. Number one, no quality gets left behind, so we don't risk detraining one quality as we move from one block to the next, like the block periodization approach. And number two is each quality builds onto the next quality. So for example, we know that hypertrophy is going to support strength development. We know strength supports speed and power. And then obviously endurance and conditioning are going to support your ability to repeat and maintain these high intensity efforts, which are so common in boxing. And so the downfall of those other approaches is that if you're only training one quality at a time, you never truly maximize the next one, because that other quality prior to it is actually starting to detrain and you're letting that foundation fade away. So keep that in mind, because we're actually going to look at that in an example and it'll all come together. So let's take a look at a practical example of a 16-week training plan leading into a fight. and with camp basically starting around the week 8 mark. And the process I follow is pretty simple. We essentially work backwards from the fight, and we're going to ask ourselves, what qualities do we need to peak on fight night? So for most boxers, this is going to be speed, power, reactivity, and a bit of strength. I won't touch too much on conditioning because that's kind of outside of the realm of this video, but from a strength and power perspective, that's what we're going to be trying to peak come fight night. Now, instead of giving each quality its own block to work on, we're going to train all of the qualities all at once, but we're just going to give a different percentage volume to each quality and progress those over that 16-week plan. So let's jump into what those 16 weeks might look like. And I've got some graphs here to essentially break down the percentages of what each quality will get. And for ease of understanding, I'm basically going to break down those qualities into speed, power, and reactivity, strength, hypertrophy, and then accessories and conditioning. And so if we look at the first phase, which would be weeks 1 to 4, we're essentially going to be mainly focusing on developing a bit of muscle through some hypertrophy and then some strength endurance focus. So as you can see, speed, reactivity, and power only has 15%, strength 30%, hypertrophy 40%, and then accessories and conditioning might be 15% of the total volume of the program. So in this first phase, the overall goal is to build some muscle and build some general work capacity. And this is key for 2 reasons. Obviously, setting the foundation for heavier, more explosive training later. And it's also important, like I mentioned earlier, that we do put on a little bit of muscle to act as kind of that armor and joint health approach. So in this first phase, the goal is to obviously build some muscle, a little bit, albeit depending on what your actual goal is as a boxer, but also build a lot of general work capacity. So this is obviously going to be key for 2 reasons. 1, it's going to set the foundation for heavier, more intense blocks later, which are going to be focused towards speed and power. And then 2, like I mentioned before, having a bit of muscle is obviously going to be key from a armor building standpoint, but also an overall joint health standpoint. So this is why for the overall volume, if we're looking at 100% of being at all, our strength and hypertrophy actually takes up around 70% of the overall volume. Next, we jump into the second phase from weeks 5 to 8, and this would be more of a strength hypertrophy focus. Now, it's not too different from that first phase. The only thing that changes is the relative percentages of the strength and hypertrophy. In the previous block, we had 30% to strength and 40% to hypertrophy. Now we might have 40% to strength, 30% to hypertrophy, and then still 15% each for the speed, reactivity, and power, and then the accessories and then conditioning. So we're essentially shifting our focus a little bit from building muscle to building more strength, but still maintaining those qualities that we developed in the previous block. This is why strength gets that higher percentage. And moving into the third phase, this is where camp might start, so around 8 weeks in. And this is where we really start to ramp up the speed, reactivity, and power focus. And so you'll notice the strength volume actually stays the same, around 40%, but the hypertrophy is reduced from 30 to 15%, so it's just broken in half. And this gives us more volume to focus towards speed, reactivity, and power, as these are the qualities that we really want to peak come fight night. And so 4 weeks out, in our 4th phase of the 16-week cycle, this is where we're really emphasizing our speed and power focus. And so as you can see from the graph, 50% of our overall training volume is put towards speed, reactivity, and power, 25% towards strength, 10% towards hypertrophy, and then 15% has kept consistent throughout for their accessories and conditioning. And so because we're wanting these qualities to be peaked without losing the other qualities, this is why there's such a high contribution to the overall percentage from those speed, power, and reactivity. But the overall contribution from the strength and hypertrophy has dropped down a lot. If we look back to the first block, we were at 40 or 70% overall volume for the strength and hypertrophy. Now we're down to only 35% for the strength and hypertrophy, as speed, power, and reactivity are going to be the predominant qualities we're looking to develop. So the strength becomes maintenance, hypertrophy drops right down, and everything is basically built around maximizing our speed, power, and reactivity for fight night. And that's the beauty of vertical integration. We're training all physical qualities all year round, but just shifting the emphasis from one block to the other rather than completely removing them. No quality is lost or we go into a state of detraining for that quality. Each one just supports the next, and then we can go into maintenance whilst we focus on peaking other qualities. So by the time fight night comes around, you're not just fast, powerful, reactive. You've still got your high strength levels. You've still kept that muscle that you put on in the early phases of camp. You've still got your endurance. You've built a complete, well-rounded performance profile that will actually help you in the fight. So if you've been struggling to find the right balance between peaking the right qualities at the right time without letting others go into a state of detraining, make sure you give this approach a go. And if you found this helpful or have any questions related to periodization for boxing and how this relates to your strength and conditioning, drop a comment below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And of course, make sure to like and subscribe for more breakdowns like this.